After an unprecedented bushfire in Australia, an aspiring documentary filmmaker joins two conservationists in venturing into the outback to track and record all the animals left displaced by the bushfires when they discover a terrifying unknown species. Bailey, a documentary filmmaker, is filming Grace, an ecologist in conservation, as the latter explains the traits of a few animals around them, like koalas and dingoes. Grace explains that due to the bushfire, there are more than 100 endangered species, and if they don't do something to help these animals, they will soon become extinct. Soon after, Ben, a master field biologist, arrives, and Bailey thanks the two of them for accepting her and taking her on their team, as no one else wanted to do it. The three of them joked around for a while before going straight onto business. Bailey interviews a park ranger named Matt, and the latter explains what park rangers like him do, which is to maintain campgrounds, control feral animals, look out for any illegal hunting, and more. Since the trio is going to venture into the outback, Matt got their coordinates so they could activate the emergency beacon and send out a distress signal if they needed to. They are also going to use a satellite phone as there is no reception in the outback. Ben wraps a camera around a tree. He explains that this device gets activated by heat and motion, and they are going to leave 4 of these devices at different sites to survey the bushfire regrowth area for wildlife. Bailey interviews Grace and Bailey about their action to conserve the endangered species, how to make plans for the future even if there isn't going to be one, and if the two conservationists believe that science can save the world. Nightfall came, and a hunter named Gary had set out a campfire for the night when his dog, Goose, sensed something nearby. Gary lets the dog be as Goose runs towards a huge tree with a hole in its trunk, whining as it stares inside it. Something inside the tree hole moves, and Gary hears Goose whimpering loudly. He goes to check out what happened, but he can't find Goose anywhere. He sees the tree and checks inside to see if Goose is inside, but the dog isn't, and he stands around the area while. That's when he hears something moving above him that causes him to look up. Gary yelps and blood spatters on the ground. Meanwhile, the trio is walking, following a trail they made, as Grace plays nature and animal sounds with the megaphone Ben is holding. She plays a record of an owl's hoot, and the three of them silently cheered when they heard an owl hoot somewhere in the woods. Using a thermal, they surveyed the area and they cooed in adoration as they saw a baby koala just waking up from a 20-hour nap. Bailey checks the trees using the thermal camera and detects something up on the trees. But when Grace and Ben turn to look, the creature was gone. The trio is then startled when something quickly passes by behind them. They laughed as they tried to guess what it was that passed by, assuming that it was just some kind of animal. They went back to their campsite and talked about themselves for a while before going to sleep. But Bailey couldn't sleep because of the creepy sounds some kind of animal was making. Grace explains that it was just an expressive possum, and Ben, sensing that Bailey was not comfortable due to the sounds the possum was making, suggested that Bailey sleep in Grace's tent. Bailey did, and the two girls talked for a while before letting their sleepiness take over. The next day, Ben and Grace are packing up while Bailey is filming a tree with holes in its trunk. The trio then drives to a different site to retrieve the cameras left by another team. They passed by a certain tree and stopped when they found a huge fallen tree blocking the way. They continued on foot, and Grace marked a hollow-bearing tree. She explains that a hollow-bearing tree supports a diverse range of animals, so if it is removed, it can be the final factor that will affect the extinction of one species, which, in turn, would affect the survival of a whole other species. While walking, Ben can't help but notice that the birds seem agitated and the forest itself feels strange. They found one of the cameras left behind by another team on the ground and checked its contents, realizing that it was in still mode. Pictures of different animals passing by are shown until they stumble upon a picture of a deer seemingly getting captured by something they couldn't recognize due to the camera being blocked. They thought that it must have been illegal hunting and called Ranger Matt, who agreed to go to where they were. The trio continued looking around until they discovered a skeleton of what they assumed was a big animal. They also noticed bits of gray fur left behind. Bailey, with her camera, walks away from the two conservationists to continue looking around when she notices huge claw marks on a tree. Grace and Ben approached the tree and noticed how huge the claw marks were. And whatever animal it was had 2 thumbs, which Grace explains that some marsupials have for climbing and hunting. They realized that the owner of those claw marks probably went up the tree for the bait they would often leave behind. Ben suggests leaving more baits so they can find out what it was, knowing that Matt would kill if they couldn't identify the animal. After leaving some bait, the trio decided to linger around the area and talk while waiting for Ranger Matt. Bailey films Ben as the master field biologist talks about the history of carnifex, a term used to refer to the public executioners in ancient Rome, which literally means the maker of meat. During the last days of the dinosaurs, the ancient ancestors of marsupials were a lot bigger than the present marsupials, and among them was T. carnifex, which was highly territorial, said that if you enter its territory, it will prey on you. But unlike lions, carnifex were extremely smart and strategic. They will hunt a prey down by silently stalking them, and once they find a perfect chance, they will jump on their prey. It will bite down the prey's jugular and sever the spinal cord. But according to accepted science, carnifex went extinct due to the natural climate change that occurred. It was already dark, but there was still no sign of Matt. The trio is getting curious why he was taking so long, and Ben decides to send a message to the ranger. Unbeknownst to the trio, Matt had already reached the area even before nightfall came but stumbled upon an abandoned car. He checked the forest and discovered an abandoned site, which was actually the site Gary set up. He continues looking around when he finds a gun on the ground beside a tree. That's when he sees Goose staring at him from behind the tree, emitting a growl that sounds like it's scared or threatened. Next thing Matt knows, an unknown animal pounces on him, biting down his jugular and dragging it into its lair. Using a thermal camera, Ben notices something coming from behind a tree, and the trio stares as they anticipate what is coming. Disappointment is written on their faces as they realize that it was just a feral goat. They turn to leave when they hear the goat whimpering, and when they look back, the goat is gone and a growling can be heard as they notice an unknown species climbing a tree. Instead of being scared, the trio is happy to see that there is an unknown species that will be ID'd by none other than them. Ben and Grace excitedly talk about how they're going to be in biology books for discovering a new species as they continue watching the animal through the thermal camera. Bailey, on the other hand, set up a drone to take a closer look at the species. She controlled the drone and went closer to the tree. Bailey and Grace are getting anxious as they realize that the drone is scaring the unidentified animal away. But Ben urges her to get the drone closer and huffs in frustration when the unidentified animal jumps away. Ben proceeds on following the unidentified animal, and Grace tells Bailey to stay put while she follows Ben. Grace tries to tell Ben to stop, but the latter just keeps on walking. Ben only stopped when he heard Grace yelp, and when he turned, Grace was nowhere to be found. He follows the sound of Grace groaning in pain and sees that she has fallen into a pit. Ben got something to help Grace out of the pit when the unidentified animal jumped on him from above a tree. The unidentified animal drags him somewhere, and Grace lies on the ground, hiding underneath a tree branch as she feels the unidentified animal standing on top of her, searching. Meanwhile, Bailey is still standing where the conservationists left her, flying the drone around her in fear of the unidentified animal coming at her. She hears something jumping from trees to trees, and when she sees Ben's head-mounted flashlight falling from a tree, she quickly runs away in fear, calling for Grace. She finds the car and gets inside to hide, honking the horn to get the others' attention. The unidentified animal hears this and walks away from Grace, who crawled out of the pit and hid inside the shed they found earlier. Bailey hears something from outside the door and cautiously opens it to see a dog, Goose, looking in. She invites the dog in and quickly closes the door. Ben, on the other hand, was left on top of the tree, severely injured. He moved and fell from the tree before crawling into the hollow of the tree to hide, not knowing that it was the unidentified animal's home. He feels something dripping on his cheek, and when he looks up, he realizes that the unidentified animal looks exactly like the carnifex was what he was talking about. The carnifex growled and pounced on him, dragging him up for a nice meal. Grace notices multiple holes on the shed's wall and peeks through them when she hears something. The carnifex passes by the shed and she flinches away from the wall, backing away in fear as the carnifex searches for a way inside the shed. Grace runs out of the shed and into the car, startling Bailey, who has fallen asleep. Grace tells Bailey what happened and they ran back into the forest to help Ben, with Goose following them. They find the hollow-bearing tree and see blood all over it and inside the tree. Grace checks the stuff left on the ground, crying upon realizing that it was Ben's. They heard the carnifex approaching and ran back to the car. They drive away, but an uphill slope prevents the car from moving, and they step out of the car again to get it up. Grace attached a rope puller to the tree and the car before telling Bailey to get back inside the car to keep it moving while she stays outside to guide. But the rope snaps, hitting Grace and causing the car to roll down the slope. Bailey cries out in pain but abruptly stops when she hears the carnifex approaching. She grabs the thermal camera and looks around, getting startled when the carnifex jumps on the car. The carnifex looked at her, the windshield being the only thing keeping them apart. When the camera Bailey was holding suddenly flashed, it blinded the carnifex for a bit. The carnifex went beside the car and tried to get in, failing and leaving when Bailey hit it. Grace then appears from behind Bailey and the latter offers her hand to help Grace into the car for a bit of safety. But they quickly learned that it wasn't safe inside the car at all as the carnifex grabbed Bailey by the leg and dragged her out of the car. Unexpectedly, Goose reappears from wherever he was hiding and bites the carnifex, distracting it from Bailey. Bailey runs behind Grace, who followed them with a gun and yelled at Goose to step away from the carnifex. The gun only had one bullet and Grace took her time shooting the carnifex. She was able to hit the carnifex, but it didn't faze the centuries-old animal. The carnifex stared at them for a while, unmoving, before deciding its prey were too tiring to catch and giving up. The rain fell, and the two survivors, 3 if we include Goose, sighed in relief. Without any cars, they were left with no choice but to walk their way out of the carnifex territory and out of the forest.